Attorney General William Barr is in Alaska tonight, and that's still not far enough from Washington to avoid the blowback from what we witnessed in those stern words from Robert Mueller today. In plain English, Bill Barr might have played his old friend Bob Mueller when he got out ahead of the Mueller report and did advanced damage control, giving air cover to his boss, the president, by speaking first. Today, Mueller directly contradicted some of Barr's claims. Here are some examples.
Under long-standing department policy, a president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office.
We specifically asked him about the OLC opinion and whether or not he was taking the position that he would have found a crime but for the existence of the OLC opinion. And he made it very clear several times that that was not his position.
If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so.
He made it clear that he had not made the determination that there was a crime.
Charging the president with a crime was therefore not an option we could consider.
Well, this will be interesting. With us tonight, Cynthia Alksne, a former federal prosecutor and a veteran of the Justice Department who worked with both Bill Barr and Robert Mueller, and Matthew Miller, former chief spokesman over at the Justice Department. Cynthia, you know what I'm going to say. One of the last times I spoke to you on television was after Barr was appointed, and you had a lot of company in saying this, to be fair. You said you were going to give him the benefit of the doubt because you had served under him, because it was his signature on your certificate when you became a Fed. What do you make of the name Bill Barr now?
Well, I think he's a liar. I mean, it's a sad thing to say, but I can't be more, I like to be direct, and here I am being direct. Bill Barr led the country to believe that Mueller did not take into account the OLC memo and the rule that you can't indict a sitting president. And that's what he led us to believe. And that isn't true. And you can use a lot of fancy words to say it, and you can hide in Alaska, and you can do all kinds of things. But the bottom line is he lied to us.
So, Matt, how big a service, looking back on it, did this pliant attorney general supply to the man he apparently regards as his client, the man who appointed him the president of the United States?
He did an extraordinary service, because if you look at what the misstatements come down to, a lot of them revolve around what happens next. If you take Bill Barr's view of the world, nothing should happen next, because his view of the world, there was no obstruction, there was no collusion. He said both of those things in his press conference and at other times in his testimony before Congress. And so there's nothing else that needs to be done. There's nothing Congress needs to do. And if you look at what Mueller said in his report and what he reiterated again today, he very specifically didn't make that determination around obstruction because it's someone else's call, because it's Congress's call. So the way that Bill Barr took that off the table kind of early on, and it was even before that press conference, remember, he took it off in that letter that was released almost a month before the press conference. He gave, the political momentum, the president, the political momentum he needed to try to head off any kind of impeachment proceeding. That may not ultimately be successful, but it's at least been successful in, thwarting any momentum so far. And I think that was a huge, huge benefit for him.
Cynthia, it's so easy for people like me in the cheap seats to look at this and think or say that Barr played Mueller. A subset of that, however, is it possible that Mueller is kind of the last of a breed? It has taken him weeks to come forward and add to what we know, add to the coverage, speak up for his own work product. Is he operating off a rule book from another better time, perhaps?
Well, I do think he's operating off a rule book that doesn't include constant television. On some level, this is something that doesn't come naturally to him. And if you think back to Comey, I mean, people are used to now, because of the way Comey reacted in the Hillary Clinton investigation and the way he's testified in the Hill, they're used to the prosecutor as coming on television as a storyteller. It's actually pretty improper, and it's not the way it should be done. So if he's the last of a breed, I'm sorry about it, because I would hope that is the breed that we would continue to have. You know, it's interesting that he accepted the OLC memo in a very different way than most of us did. He not only said the OLC memo is a rule and you can't indict a sitting president, he took it one step further. He had absorbed that as a rule and found that it was actually unconstitutional to indict a sitting president. He is somebody who absorbs these rules into his DNA, and I hope he's not the end of the breed, but he might be.
Matt, you're the comms guy here. As a viewer, the scene today was as kind of spare and taciturn as the speaker. In that auditorium we all know very well. You know it differently from those of us, again, in the cheap seats where the guests sit. What did you make of it as a communications event?
You know, it was a very effective event, but it was an event that came really a month or a month and a half too late. I mean, try to imagine what would have happened if the first thing that the public would have heard about the report would have been this press conference that Bob Mueller gave today, rather than allowing Bill Barr to get out and frame the event first. It would have been an entirely different exercise, I think. And I think, you know, Cynthia's point about him not operating in television land, I think, is largely right. But this isn't really anything new. This is kind of the way he operated as the FBI director. I can't tell you how many times I tried to convince him and tried to convince his staff, the FBI, to have him stand up and do press conferences. And he just never wanted to kind of lend his personal credibility in a way that could be politicized. And I think you saw that here in this investigation. And I think, you know, when you question whether he should have done it earlier or not, I think it's one thing for him to know that the president was going to misuse his words. And I think he probably would have expected that. But I think what he couldn't have expected and what he didn't expect was that the attorney general would misuse what he said and that the attorney general would mislead the public about what he said. That's an extraordinary thing for an attorney general to do to any prosecutor, especially one he's known so long that was handling such an important mission. I think that must have deeply disappointed him, and it was one of the reasons you saw him do what he did today.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.